So this video is going to give you 5 signs you are not an INFP. It's fair to say the INFP is a very, very common source of mistyping, standing up there shoulder to shoulder with the likes of the INTJ, the INFJ, but in terms of the sheer variety of types that misidentify as INFP, I'd say this type wins the race. I'm talking ISFJs, ISTJs, ISFPs, INTPs, INFJs, ENTPs, ENFPs, ESFPs. And there was good reason for this. I mean, many individuals are introverted, intuitive feeling and perceiving. Especially, let's be honest, amidst the times we currently find ourselves, but the dichotomies alone do not make somebody an INFP. There is only a very small overlap between behavior and cognition. For example, let us take the judging versus perceiving dichotomy. Well, many INFPs are highly systematic and conscientious and therefore more likely to receive a judging score. Thinking versus feeling. Well, being an introverted feeling dominant influences the manner of your thinking, but not the extent of it. And then intuition. Well, for example, an ISFP can be in every way more intuitive than they are sensing. And yes, this does happen, especially within this community. But they will not match the INFP cognition, despite receiving an INFP result from a test. And for this reason, I will not be using these dichotomies for the video, because I do not believe they will help you in determining whether or not you are an INFP. However, I'm making a small exception for the introversion versus extroversion spectrum, but not in the way that it is commonly understood. You see, many INFPs are sociable. They are happy to interact with external reality. However, they remain in every way, shape and form a cognitive introvert. And cognitive introversion can be understood through a spectrum of cognitive proactivity versus cognitive reactivity. The INFP, being an introverted feeling dominant, is more cognitively proactive than they are cognitively reactive. Proactive not in the behavioral sense of having high initiative, but rather in the cognitive sense of internalizing thought before externalizing energy. An ESFP, an ENTP, these types can very much be behaviorally introverted, spending much time in solitude, preferring their own company. But the time they spend in their own company will still be spent largely interacting with an external medium. They could be going down a rabbit hole of research, they could be acquiring and refining a skill set, but the energy here will be directed much more externally than it is internally. They are in a reactive state. Conversely, the INFP is much more cognitively proactive. This is not to say they spend zero time in a reactive state, but rather to say their natural predisposition is towards an internal dialogue over an external one. And it is not uncommon for an INFP to be surrounded by myriad external stimuli and still remain completely immersed within their own headspace. And the tendency here is to conceptualize the external world more than interact with it. As such, irrespective of how much alone time you might enjoy, if you spend the majority of your time interacting with an external medium, creatively or otherwise, it is pretty unlikely you are an INFP. As while the INFP can enjoy a reactive state just like anybody else, the natural inclination here is towards a state of internal reflection and even a level of disconnect from external reality. Sign number 2, the INFP is an introverted feeling dominant. Contrary to popular myth, this does not entail a naively idealistic individual wrapped up in the cocoon of their own feelings and sensitivities. Rather, introverted feeling here serves as the focal point of the psyche, much more than the entirety of it. INFPs tend to have an excellent employment of both introverted thinking and introverted intuition, but these functions are being accessed through the gateway of the dominant. What does this mean? Well, in a nutshell, the INFP engages these functions as a natural extension of self-concept, much more than they do independently of it. Introverted feeling in the dominant position lends the INFP a logical style which is much more attached than it is detached, and as such the INFP philosophizes, researches, creates much more as a means of self-expression and self-actualization. And as such, if you experience a level of detached curiosity, perhaps even enjoying puzzles and challenges entirely for their own sake, perhaps even experiencing a level of disconnect from the self in the process, it is very unlikely you are an INFP. And this brings us to the 3rd sign you are not an INFP. You know who you are. And yes, you heard me correctly. This is, in my opinion, the single greatest myth attributed to INFPs. With introverted feeling here in the dominant position, the self is not this static concept to be observed and abided by, but rather something entirely more fluid and malleable. Introverted feeling within the INFP is convergent, and therefore this is a realm of change and control. Conversely, the INFP's extroverted intuition and extroverted thinking are divergent, and therefore much more observed than they are acted upon. And as such, introverted feeling and introverted sensing here are acted upon at the behest of observed reality. The INFP's strength lies not in this static and unyielding self-concept, but rather an identity that is fluidly changing and evolving over time. A convergent function is acted upon more than it is observed, and as such, for all the INFP may be able to control their existential reality, relate to the positions of others even, they tend to struggle to understand their feelings. They tend to struggle to render their identity static enough to even fit within a niche of society. And as such, if you know exactly who you are and find your self-concept to be an altogether more static entity to be observed and divided by, it is very unlikely you are an INFP. The INFP finds the self in a constant state of reformulation, and cementing identity into a constant can actually prove a challenge for this type. Sign number 4 that you are not an INFP. The INFP has extroverted intuitive, extroverted thinking, abstraction. The INFP's opposing functions are extroverted thinking and extroverted intuition. Being divergent by nature, they are much more observed than they are acted upon, and this has 2 ramifications. Firstly, the INFP is naturally attuned to external contingency. Since energies here are directed more towards observation, the INFP effectively perceives a grand swath of the external world and all objective values within it. And as such, the type can perceive multiple components at once and even form accurate predictions as to how one value will influence another in order to arrive at a certain outcome. This lends the type a rather empirically scientific disposition, but also programs a natural attunement to causality and contingency. And as such, for as long as the INFP evades introverted feeling dissociation, this is one of the least likely types to get carried away in the moment and lose sense of consequence. In fact, the INFP tends to be hyper-aware of potential consequences, and this can, in some instances, even lead to a kind of analysis paralysis. And as such, if you often find yourself getting carried away in the heat of the moment, completely overriding predictive capacity to just see what happens, it's pretty unlikely you are an INFP. But there's a second ramification here. As the INFP favours an extroverted intuitive perception of external reality, extroverted intuition's natural opposite, that is, extroverted sensing, tends to become something of a blind spot within this type. This dynamic renders the external world of the INFP highly abstract, even to the extent of losing a sense of tangible quality in the process. And as such, the external world here can take on a kind of ethereal quality, whereby concrete experience is oftentimes more desired than it is felt. Furthermore, the INFP even uses introverted sensing in order to essentially consolidate extroverted intuitive perception into an internalized concrete experience, effectively making up for the lack of extroverted sensing concrete experience. If you find yourself often fully engaged with, immersed within concrete experience, even experiencing floods of inspiration in the process, it is very unlikely you are an INFP. Extroverted sensing, the ability to perceive and render the external world tangible and concrete, is oftentimes a blind spot within this type. Sign number 5 that you are not an INFP. Not only does the INFP perceive the external world through extroverted intuition, but this function actually acts as the authority function for this particular type. What does this mean? Well, the authority function tends to set the agenda of the dominant functions, and as such, owing to its experiential nature, extroverted intuition is an authoritative force upon the INFP's introverted feeling and introverted sensing, causing the type to be in a constant state of adaptation to the open-ended nature of external reality. As such, the INFP is perhaps the most likely type of all to balance multiple possibilities alongside each other, and owing to the influence of this authority function, tends to have an internal dialogue that expands far more than it contracts. The contraction that does occur tends to be of a more limbic nature, for example, intent over methodology, and the cerebral components, by comparison, tend to be far more open-ended. As such, the INFP mind tends to be forever open to emerging information, and strives to reconcile multiple possibilities alongside each other. And this can lend the type a critical thought unhampered by ego, and can allow the type to perceive multiple possibilities without one blinding the self to another. As such, if you tend towards a kind of tunnel vision whereby a desired possibility essentially blinds you to all of the others, and if you consider your logic much more static than it is open-ended, it is pretty unlikely you are an INFP. Furthermore, if you find the act of juggling multiple possibilities alongside each other stressful or even unintuitive, it is again very, very unlikely you are an INFP. Bonus point, the INFP is a divergent thinker. Complementing the extroverted intuitive authority function is an extroverted thinking oppositional function. With both of these functions here divergent, the INFP much more naturally observes logic than they do act upon it. As such, the INFP tends to find themselves in a state of constant limbic adaptation, that is, FISI, to the abstract logic of external reality, TENE. It is something of a myth that the INFP has weak thinking in any way, shape or form, and introverted thinking in particular here is far stronger than that eighth slot perspective, that scrawny little function that barely ever sees the light of day, would imply. In many ways, the INFP is just as logical as a thinking dominant. What differs here is, whereas a convergent thinker like an INFJ would happily form their own conjecture, the INFP tends to consult the available literature and evidence in order to arrive at a conclusion. And the proclivity here is to present things as they are and could be over what they will and should be. The INFP, alongside the ESFJ by the way, is one of the most likely types to excel within a hard scientific environment, whereby logical frameworks are to be observed and abided by. The divergent thinking style of the INFP lends a type of preference for research over conjecture, and the type tends to be unfettered by the tunnel vision that can sometimes accrue in the over-reliance upon one's own opinion. As such, if you consider yourself highly opinionated and logically combative, and even more chaotic in your logic as you rely more upon your own conjecture, your own methodology, over pre-established frameworks, it is pretty unlikely you are an INFP. The INFP is a divergent thinker, and therefore, while of course, like anybody else, they can use thinking convergently, the overall predisposition here lends the INFP much more towards the observation of logic than the creation of it. So that concludes the video. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far, you were awesome. And if you did enjoy the video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button below. If you know anybody who you think might benefit from the contents of the video, or just find it generally interesting, be sure to share it with them. And if you haven't already done so, I highly recommend subscribing to the channel as well. And just a few more call to actions before I go. If you are interested in the very fundamentals of CPT, I highly recommend checking out the CPT ebook. And if you are uncertain about your type, or just like to know about how your type applies more specifically to you as an individual, I do offer type services and consultations. And finally, CPT is on Patreon. I'm super grateful to all of my patrons for supporting me so far and keeping a roof above my head. So if you're interested in supporting the channel on that additional level, that would be absolutely amazing. But of course, I already appreciate your support over here as well. So that's it for me. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll be back in a week's time. For now, take care.